Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on COVID-19 and African food security. My name is Ruth Hall. I'm a professor at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, class at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. And we are having a webinar today on the topic of COVID-19 and African food security. The hashtag for today's conversation is hashtag African food security. And this is part of a series of webinars that we're running that are part of a collaboration with the Network of Excellence on Land Governance in Africa. And I'm going to hand over very briefly now to our colleague, Dr. Joan Kagwanja, to introduce the Network of Excellence on Land Governance in Africa. Over to you, Joan.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks, colleagues. It's yet another webinar, and we are excited to partner with you on this. This webinar series is being held by what we call our special node, the University of Western Cape, which is a node for the Network of Excellence on Land Policy on Land Governance in Africa, a network of universities and institutions of higher learning that we have brought together under the Africa Land Policy Center umbrella to be able to boost training of land professionals, research of pertinent land governance issues in Africa, but also to provide platforms such as this one, the Conference on Land Policy in Africa and the Journal on Land Policy, to be able to promote scholarship, but also knowledge. We are excited at the opportunity to have these webinars, and I'm really just excited to welcome you and thank you for participating. Let's continue interacting on these types of platforms. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Joan. So to start us off, I would like to ask us to reflect that, of course, COVID-19 is a public health crisis, but it has also very rapidly emerged as a hunger crisis in many parts of the world. And in some cases, countries and commentators have argued that there is a trade-off of some kind between saving lives and saving livelihoods. In many respects, of course, this seems to be a false dichotomy. The reality, though, is that lockdowns that are intended to flatten the curve and limit the spread of the virus also restricts the movement of people and goods, closing down opportunities, particularly for people whose livelihoods rely on informal employment and self-employment, the vast majority of people in the global south, both those who are involved in producing food and trading it. But it also means that there is a massive income crisis for people across many sectors whose livelihoods have been disrupted by the virus. At a world scale, there is no food shortage. In fact, over the past 2 years, there have been record harvests. So there's no world food availability crisis, but there clearly is a systemic crisis around food. Alongside the food crisis, there are a number of overlapping crises: a climate crisis, a crisis of growing poverty and inequality. So there's a pandemic for which there's no cure, alongside these other crises. In this webinar today, we will be discussing food security and the impact of the virus and of response measures to food security in Africa. Food security, of course, is a concept that has evolved over time, and there are alternative ideas about how we should be thinking about people's rights and access to food, including food sovereignty, and we will be discussing that today. So partly what the point is here is to clarify the different framings and narratives concerning the impacts of COVID-19 on food security and the types of responses that have emerged. Globally, over 821 people are classified as chronically food insecure, of whom about 135 million are in acute hunger. And this is projected to double. That's over 250 million people in acute hunger. In Africa, there are around 30 million people who are facing extreme food insecurity. This is largely in the conflict zones, for instance, northeast Nigeria, South Sudan. But we have a number of crises to be confronting at the same time right now: locusts, drought, and the ongoing climate crisis. Across the continent, the World Food Programme estimates that agricultural output will decline by about 3 to 7%, and imports will decline possibly as much as 25%. So clearly there's a massive problem both with disruption of value chains, both domestic and regional, more than global, in fact. But importantly, a massive loss of cash incomes. And so perhaps with those words, I can frame, in a sense, the different ways in which we understand this issue, which is on the one hand, some disruption to production, but much more than production, the crisis of distribution and entitlement and access to food. I'd like to now kick off the webinar by introducing our first speaker, who is joining us from Mali. Professor Mamadou Goita is a teacher and researcher. He's executive director of IRPAD Africa, that is the Institute for Research and Promotion of Alternatives in Development. This is at the University of Bamako in Mali. He's a member of the IPES, the International Panel of Experts on Food, and he is also a board member of the African Development Bank. He's also, I must say, the only person I've ever met who has visited every single African country, and so is truly an expert. Mamadou, perhaps if we can start with you, could you take us through what you see as the most significant impacts of the COVID-19 crisis and of the various measures that governments have imposed to deal with the pandemic on food security continentally and also the variations across the regions? Over to you, Mamadou.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. It's not such a good condition of speaking. I'm sorry that to join just now because I had a meeting at the Ministry of Agriculture for some of these issues. I will emphasize on some key elements that can be considered as impacting actually the food and nutrition issues in the continent. The first one is the market issue, because one of the key measures that have been taken by many countries, and I will focus on West Africa, has been closing in some countries 100% of the market. In other cases, between 30% and 50% of the market that has been closed, in impacting access to this market, and then also impacting the food price in different markets. So talking about the case of West Africa, for instance, if you look at what happened in Burkina Faso, a total of 30 markets has been closed for the first time, and 6 others have been added to that. So if you look at this trend, is more than 50% of the food market that have been closed during the COVID-19 period. It has not only impacted on the price of foodstuff for those people living at city level, plus in some cases, in the case of Burkina Faso, plus 30% of the price of price rise of foodstuff in some of the cities compared to last year for the same period, because we are a pre-campaign period actually. So because this market has been closed, that food prices have gone up, just not allowing people in the cities to access to it. You go to countries like Nigeria, that when they have been closing, mainly if you look at 6 zones that have been studied by a collective research done at the SCPC level. So about 100% of the market has been closed, impacting not only the cost of foodstuff, but also the access to smallholder farmers to these markets. So some of them have dropped. More than 42% of the revenue have dropped because they couldn't bring the production that they had in this market. So there are 2 categories then of market that we have been just facing in the context of West Africa. First, countries that have been closing for 100% all the market, the prices have been increasing more than those who have been closing for 50%. And in some countries, market has not been closed, like the case of Mali. So if you look at the figures that are here, actually, the price of the foodstuff has remained the same like last year, compared to the last two years. This means that the closing of the market has been impacting very highly the foodstuff the prices. It's the same on the cattle market also, that the prices have been going very up compared to this. So if you look at the variation of prices in that context, you have Benin in West Africa -7%, and the variation has been about 8%. If you look at we look at the cattle market, Burkina Faso -6, with 15%, -15% on cattle. You have Mali that is 0, because it's the same. The price has remained the same because the market has not been closed. So just to show you that increase of 28% for Nigeria, 16% for Senegal, and Togo also, because they didn't close. Also, the essential market is 0%, only 5% for the cattle. So the second thing that I will emphasize on is, in terms of impact, is the you know that in the Sahel countries, for instance, between 65 to 83% of the revenue of some of the households, mainly small-scale farmers, is on vegetable growing during the dry season. Since they have been locked, access to seed has been problematic and all, and then it has been creating a lot of difficulty for these families. So people are losing, some are losing almost 100% of this revenue because they couldn't produce. But for some others, they lost about between 32 to 45% of their revenue. And this, if you include, you have the correlation between this revenue and the total revenue that they have every year, is a loss of about 63%, or between 63% and 80% of the total revenue from smallholder farmers in the context of Sahel countries. So it's a big loss for them, impacting also on the food security and the nutrition quality of food at different level. And the last one that I will mention in that sake, in terms of impact, is in the pastoralist area, when countries has been closing the borders. So the movement of animal, the period of the pandemic came in a period when pastoralist group will move from one country to another, and there is already a big challenge of conflict between farmers and pastoralist groups. Now with the pandemic, it has created more contentious problems, impacting probably the new rainy season that is starting, and then between creating different difficulties for different farmers to go in their farm. So these are some of the three issues that I want to really highlight on this impact issue: the price of food, the capacity of production from smallholders, contributing to just lower the production in different countries and different areas, and the conflicts that are emerging between different segments of the food system, and that is also creating a big of difficulties to people. And then if you look at what will happen the coming months, with the rainy season starting with no seeds for some times, no fertilizer for others, it will be probably a very big problems in the future of most of these smallholder farmers.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mamadou. So, I mean, I think that what's helpful here is that you've sketched out for us the ways in which access to inputs has been disrupted, the ways in which production has been disrupted, and in the way access to markets is being disrupted. One of the things that strikes me about what you're saying is that we may not be seeing the full impacts on food security now. In fact, for many people, what we may see is a lagged effect. People who failed to get income from this harvest being unable to plant again in the next harvest. Clearly, though, the problem of the food security crisis extends far beyond those who produce food. I'm so aware of this in South Africa, where we have a highly urbanized population, relatively few people are involved directly with food production, and yet there is massive hunger. So clearly we must also consider the wider questions of food security. I'm at this point very pleased to introduce to you again, but perhaps at greater length, I want to mention her background, Dr. Joan Kagwanja, who is, as well as being very much the brains and the impetus behind NELGA, she is the chief of the Agriculture and Business Enabling Environment Group and coordinator of the African Land Policy Center at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And previously, she headed up the Land Policy Initiative, which was a joint initiative of the African Union, UNECA, and African Development Bank, and very much the precursor to NELGA. She holds a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri and joins us now from Kenya. Thanks so much, Joan. Over to you, and perhaps you can sketch out for us the responses of African governments and intergovernmental organizations. We know that the ministers of agriculture across all member states of the African Union met and released a declaration on COVID-19 and food security and nutrition on the 16th of April. There have been many initiatives at country level and at continental level to address this issue. Can you outline for us what you think the most important measures are that are being taken?
Thank you so much, and a pleasure to listen to Professor Goita, obviously. What he has articulated is some of what we have seen because of supply chain interruptions. And so the whole supply chain relating to agricultural inputs and also food inputs. And this is where I think most governments are concerned. And the concern here is, as you know, Africa does import quite a bit of its food. So on the food side, just countries making sure that they have the food reserves that they need. As we know, regional food reserves have not been working as envisaged under the African Union Commission's, the African Union's declarations that there is enough food in the regions. We know that West Africa had food reserves at some point, but at this point, we are not as well, I would say, organized as we would like to be. And so that is a concern. The concern is, how do we ensure that we have the food imports that we need, or the food that we need from the import side, because we can't ignore the fact that we have the imports. On the production side, as Mamadou has pointed out quite well, is that how do we ensure that our farmers have the agricultural inputs that they need at a reasonable price, even as our resources are diverted into the health sector. As you know, obviously, the response was beginning very much in the health sector. And so the initial push was to get the PPEs, even from the private sector side. The work that we at ECA have done, for instance, with the Flexing Bank, was initially to try and make sure that companies in Africa can quickly convert their production systems to produce PPEs, those that are in the cotton sector or the fabric sector and all that, and also getting the gloves and other equipment. So the agricultural sector now, we are starting to hear more about it. And even ourselves, we've seen that there's a push now to make sure some of the facilities that are being set up at continental level to address the issue of COVID, working closely with the Africa CDC, are also including food as an essential item. So it's not just medical services as essential items. So the way that governments responded, obviously at the beginning, was to divert their resources to the health sector. But we have also seen that, especially for those that are now within the planting season, there is efforts to make sure that they do provide the fertilizer, the seed, and other inputs that are needed. But that there is a concern because, of course, they don't have enough resources. So ensuring that governments, even if they need to get loans or grants or concessional loans, they can put together bankable projects, so providing technical assistance to governments to be able to get the resources that they need there. Obviously, we do need, even as we are promoting the provision of these items, to make sure that the smallholder farmers benefit, but also that within the smallholder farmer group, you look at women as a special group, but also other producers, whether you're looking at pastoralists and others, in terms of being able to facilitate them in that regard. Ruth, if you don't mind, I also want to bring up the issue of land, because we have seen that as resources are diverted, as people are working away from home, that the services that are provided by government and the judicial system with regard to securing land rights, at this point, there is a real challenge. And so we want to make sure that this item is not left unattended, because when the government is away, when the eyes are away, that's when the elite come into the space and start probably invading the invasions of land that is owned by the poor, or the lack of resolution of boundary disputes. This time is really, really tough. And we want to especially look at the issue of women's land rights, because people continue to need that support and that care, especially during this particular time.
Thank you so much, Joan.
Ruth, we can't hear you.
Apologies for that. Let me try again. I want to read a quote from the World Bank. Recently, the Vice President, Jürgen Vogele, said this: "You can't have social distancing if every smallholder farmer in Africa or Asia needs to get on the truck to get food to market every day." Now, what he was saying was that in countries in many parts of Africa and Asia, 60 to 70% of the population are involved in agriculture. This poses a health risk if people are involved in production and moving about, as opposed to 3 to 4% of the populations in many countries in Europe and North America. So he was arguing that those countries with a high proportion of its population in agriculture are most at risk. So the broad prescription from the World Bank and some other international institutions is that to deal with the crisis, Africa should continue to rely on global markets. There should be no export bans or hoarding of food supplies. And broadly, the responses focus on emergency relief for farmers in the form of inputs, mostly pesticide, fertilizer, etc., for some farmers, but also food relief for consumers. It strikes me that this response, focusing on producers and consumers in a context where a whole lot of movement has been shut down, is maybe missing the question of how the food system actually operates. So at this point, I'm very happy to pull into the conversation Dr. Miljan Bile, who joins us now. He is the coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, a civil society group, which is a network across the continent. He's a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, and he's the founder of an indigenous NGO in Ethiopia that works on issues of agroecology, intergenerational learning, advocacy, and livelihoods for various people. So, Dr. Bile, if I can pose this question to you, how are we really to understand the food security problem that we face in Africa now? We've heard about some impacts, a lot of very worrying statistics. We've heard about the kinds of responses from African governments. Now, if you can explain to us your understanding of the impacts and what this means for food security in Africa. And of course, there are these two different terms, food security and food sovereignty. Perhaps could you clarify the difference between the two and how perhaps a food sovereignty perspective might differ in this moment of crisis? So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Plus, and thank you also, Nalga, for offering this opportunity to the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. The Alliance is the biggest civil society movement in Africa. We have 40 members and we work in 50 of the 55 countries in Africa. We have farmers, fisher folks, pastoralists, indigenous peoples, consumers, faith-based institutions, women networks, youth networks, and indigenous civil society organizations. So as you can see, it's a broad-based institute or organization. I would like to talk about this in short. I mean, it will take even a day to fully explain what food security and what food sovereignty is. But in a kind of a broad brush, I would like to explain about food security a little bit, And I would like to bring in also right to food in the context of COVID, and also food sovereignty. Food security has, four important questions. I mean, if we go by how it has come as a concept, it started with the availability of food, availability of adequate food, and distributed through local production ways. But later on, through a lot of research on poverty specifically, people felt that, food can be available, but if it is not, economically available to people, if there is no access, economic access to it, and physical access to it, then availability is not enough. So access was included, but later people felt that we need to include other non-food elements like health, sanitation, and also nutritional aspect of food. So utilization has come into the picture. But later on, what about stabilization? It has to be stable, food, you can have access, you can utilize, food can be available, but it can be available at one point, maybe absent in another. So stability is important. So stability was included, but later discussions are also bringing agency, which is the capacity of people to produce their own food, and also sustainability. I think the latest high-level panel of experts report on food security includes these two elements, getting closer to food security. And I would like to bring in another concept called food rights, or right to food. The right to food divides, the population into right holders and duty bearers. So right holders do have the food, what I outlined in food security. So in that way, food security and right to food are similar, but it adds also responsibility on the duty bearers. The duty bearers are responsible. Governments are actually responsible to provide food to people. So in the context of COVID, governments are obliged to provide food to people, and also in terms of development, they are obliged to come out of this COVID situation in a way food production is sustainable in terms of the ecological side of it, and also it has to be socially sustainable, and it has to bring other concepts that I would later on outline. But after people have looked at the definition of food security and food and the right to food, and they felt that it is not enough. It doesn't answer the political situation. Food production or food system in general is a political question, because food security, whoever produced it, and however the food is produced, then you can be food secure. But in this corporatized world where people want to sell agrochemicals and also hybrid seeds, including genetically modified seeds, and a lot of techniques, now digitalization of African agriculture. In all that context, I think we have to bring in other elements, because in production systems which are aligned to food security have resulted in such a lot of havoc. We can mention the Green Revolution that has happened in Asia. There was an environmental ecological crisis. There was a cultural crisis. There was a health crisis. There was a social crisis. So after observing all that, then those thinkers around food systems said that no, I think food, we have to bring in another concepts for food. It doesn't actually reject the goals of the food security, but the way food is produced and the way ownership is handled is not right. So elements have started to come in, which are basically, food has to be produced in a healthy way, healthy both to the people and to the environment, and we have to use people's knowledge, and the food that we eat has to be also culturally appropriate. It has to be culturally appropriate. In the context of Africa, I think we have our cultural food, so it shouldn't be impacted because of production and distribution of food. And it also brought critical sides to it, and food production, food distribution, the economic side of food, and the production of sides of food, and the means of production also, the land and everything should be owned by the people. The people should own all these food production elements, and the human right context of food production and processing and handling is very, very critical. So because of this, now slowly but surely the idea of the concept of food sovereignty is getting currency, and COVID has shown that food sovereignty is a really, really valuable concept. To begin with, because of this COVID, as both Mamadou and the honorable, I'm sorry to forget the name, I think it was, has explained, as John, I think, has explained, there was impact in terms of transportation of food. There was also impact on huge reliance on agrochemicals and hybrid seeds. So the food sovereignty concept and action is much more critical right now, because it talks about diversity, biodiversity, and diversity is so critical to our health. It talks about ownership of the food production system and processes and seeds ownership of seeds and diversity of seeds is very much important, because we have seen the lockdown. If farmers did have their own seeds with their own, then they could have planted it. If the markets are available locally, then it would have been a disaster to go to access critical materials from the market, because people have their markets around them. People could control the markets around them. So COVID has brought the reality quite stark that the concept of food sovereignty is very much important. And also, what has exacerbated the health crisis and also economic crisis, environmental crisis, because of COVID. I think land, for example, the actual ownership of land was also one of the issues, and human rights issues also. So it is very, very critical that we stick. We develop and we work with the concept of food sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Million. So it strikes me that what we are dealing with here is in a sense two very different understandings of by what indicators should we be assessing our food system and the impacts on our food system. It strikes me that partly, Million, that what you've been describing is a situation in which the extent to which African food systems are connected into global supply chains, very much reliant on bought inputs from across the world, and selling cash crops into global markets. This commodity approach that in many cases we can have a very much a sort of a path dependency. If we think about the big commodities, agricultural commodities of West Africa, a disrupted global food system means disaster for producers that has nothing to do with the impact of the pandemic in their locality, but has to do with the wider context. So are we made much more vulnerable in terms of food insecurity by the type of agriculture and the ways in which we're linked into global markets? And this leads me to ask, in a sense, perhaps you could comment on the kind of responses that you're seeing from African governments, the kind of responses that Joan has mentioned. Do you think that the kinds of responses that we're seeing from African governments are going to address the structural problems that we see now, and what more would need to be done to provide resilience in our food systems for the future?
Yeah, I looked at some of the statements that are produced by our governments. I think they have a very, very good. I mean, there are very, very good policy directives in them. But in general, I think we have to have a very serious discussion in Africa on the future of our agricultural system. What do we want? You know, the future of our agricultural system is defined in terms of productivity alone. Produce more and calorie-rich food, and that policy direction is also defined in the interests of so many others which are outside of the continent. So that's very much critical. So we want healthy food, we want nutritionally rich food, we want to produce our food without harming our environment, we want to produce food without destroying our culture, and also protecting the human rights of our people. So this requires one, we have to decolonize our mind to begin with. We don't have to believe on the agenda that others are setting to us. And second, also, there really needs a structural change, a fundamental structural change of how we do things.
Thank you so much, Million. So this is a good point at which to perhaps turn to the fact that food security, the production, trade and consumption of food comes not only from agriculture, but also from fisheries, a very important sector in African food systems, and of course an important source of protein, but also income from exports. So I'm very pleased to introduce also now my colleague, Professor Moniba Isaacs, who is with me at PLAS at UWC in South Africa, whose research focuses on understanding social and political processes of fisheries reform in South Africa and in the region, largely looking at small-scale fisheries, artisanal fishers. And she's worked a lot with communities across the region to try to find solutions to these problems. And perhaps then, Moniba, we can ask you to come in with the fisheries lens, but asking many of the same questions. In what ways has the pandemic and government responses to the pandemic, in what ways has this affected production in the fisheries sector? To what extent is it about market disruption? So perhaps you can discuss very briefly the impact and what kinds of responses there have been, and what this means for food security, both for producers, but also for people who normally buy from fishers across Africa. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you for your introduction. Yes, like Joan, I wanted to get into fish and the importance of fish. Yes, small-scale fisheries on the continent, they are about 2.3 million around the coast of South Africa, but also inland. And 90% of the fishes on the continent are small-scale fishers. With the impact of COVID on small-scale fisheries, you can imagine everyone wants to go for a island holiday. There's a travel ban in terms of tourism, restaurant closures, and that immediately have a direct impact on the market for small-scale fisheries. No hotels to provide food, no tourists to eat the big fish, and that particularly in countries, for example, West Africa. You're looking at Mozambique. Mozambique immediately felt there's an oversupply of big fish on the market because the tourists are the ones that are going for the big fish. Seafood, there was an oversupply of seafood in West Africa because the seafood is either providing for the tourist market or it provides for the export market. So the travel ban, tourism, and also export ban immediately had a direct impact on the livelihood of small-scale fishers. But the responses of government in terms are varying. In South Africa, it was not so much that small-scale fisheries received an interim fund or a COVID fund to kind of loss of livelihoods. It was food aid, food packages. In Nigeria, it was also food aid that was provided. For example, in Tanzania, there was no hard lockdown in terms of the particular in terms of COVID, but there was definitely an increase of local supply to good fish. So indirectly, there's an opportunity that I find it is very critical to kind of look at to what extent we are so focused on an export market and tourist market that there's more fish on the market, which is highly nutritious. It is important protein for many vulnerable communities, and especially in a phase where we have the COVID. So I would say that if you look at what has been done, it also kind of feel that a lot of the like Mamadou was explaining, a lot of the fisheries related issues are more focused on the production and the consumer. And also on the export market, and the consumer is either the tourist and not so much local market. And now that we more and more talking about there's more supply of fish for the market, I think in terms of a future discussion is so important, Ruth, that the conversation must be on relocalizing the food and the food system. And this connect with what Belay is saying in terms of food sovereignty. And I think that is an important discussion that we need to have to unpack the issues around export, and export for that matter is high value species. And I think that needs to be a critical discussion and a debate, I think. Thank you.
Super. Thanks so much, Muniba. Now, I notice in the chat that there are quite a lot of discussions about the food sovereignty concept and the importance of attributing that concept to La Via Campesina, the global peasant movement that has promoted and struggled around that idea. There are two questions that I thought perhaps our panelists would like to respond to. Michael Odiambo from Kenya is asking, can the panelists address the impact of food aid on food security in Africa? Now, famously, food aid does often have the impact of undermining local food markets, depressing prices for those who are able to produce and get product to market. I remember a very influential moment in my own studies when I was reading Alex de Waal and famines, his work on famines, and also Amartya Sen, who talks about entitlements. And of course, food aid is crucial, particularly in conflict zones, particularly where there has been actual production failure. But in many respects, the food security crisis that we have in many parts of the continent right now is a crisis of entitlements. In the South African context and in many other contexts, there is food, people can't afford it, or there is food, but it can't get to market. So perhaps which of our speakers would like to, perhaps you can just indicate who would like to address this issue around food aid. Perhaps Mamadou, over to you. Over to you, Mamadou.
For me, this is one of the very, very critical issue for this period when the pandemic has brought countries to bring food aid in many countries. The example of Senegal is still in our mind, when there is not only have been a very critical kind of corruption system in the food aid, but also the way it's distributed. It's the same case also in the case of Mali. When you have rice coming on board, there are different models. There are rice from Japan that came to Mali. At the same time, Mali rice production is covering about 93% of our need in rice is produced in the country. So we need about 7% to cover, but there is a food stock that can cover the difference, the gap between the production of a year compared to the needs of a country. At the same time, you bring food aid, buying rice outside the country. There are two implications. The first one is that because the price of this food, rice coming, even it's given for free in a range of population, is also sold in what they call social cost. This is far below the cost of production of the rice that is produced in the country. This means what? First, smallholder farmers cannot sell their food, their crops. Secondly, you are using your own population to a variety of production of crops that they are not usually familiar with. So this is changing. This is a more critical point. This is changing their food habit, and that has a long-term impact in the community. So it will not only impact the production system because of the price that is given for farmers, but also it's impacting the food system of a country. And if you add to all that, in the case of some countries, it has been more than 30% of the need that is now brought by food aid. So you are also contributing to change the structure of a production system of your own country. So you have this kind of model that has been criticized for a long time. Even food aid has a charter, but because of a pandemic, any of the charter principles have been respected by most of the countries. So it's a very problematic. It will contribute also to impact the production system, but the price in the market and also the food habit of many of these communities. These are some of the few things that I can talk about, and it's impacting actually the structure of the market even when they have been open in these countries.
Thank you, Mamadou. It seems to me that we actually should have an entire session just on the issue of food aid, which is a complex area in itself. I want to go to another question. Andries de Tooy is asking about intra-regional trade. Joan, perhaps you could take this question about the implications of C-19 for intra-African trade. We know that many borders have been closed. What are the opportunities for building resilience of our food systems through greater intra-regional trade in food items?
Hi, thank you, and greetings to Andries de Tooy, and good work you're doing down there at PLAS. I think it's important for us to recall that we have on the continent, the African Continental Free Trade Area treaty that has been signed on by many of our countries, almost all the countries now. Many of them haven't ratified it. And we were supposed to sort of go live full force in July. And so in a way, what we've been advocating for at PCA is actually fast-tracking that in the context of COVID-19. So where the supply chain provides us with a challenge, especially globally, we can really benefit by opening up our markets. So first of all, by doing some of the issues I was talking about in terms of making sure that we get our food production up, probably way above our current levels, to be able to reduce our international food imports, but then to reduce our, especially non-trade barriers regionally, so that we don't lock ourselves in. We have seen some challenges when we are looking at cross-border crossings, especially in the context of COVID. So when we on the continent eased up on the movement of food, having recognized it's a special item in the context of COVID, we have seen the lines across on the border crossings, the backup of lines. And this is not the usual backup, but it is because of the issue of testing. So one of the biggest risks that there is the transportation of COVID, as you know. And so the importance of getting the testing kits at the right place on the borders And this is something we should address, not just for COVID, but in future, in terms of ensuring that there is free movement of goods and services to promote intra-regional trade in the context of the promotion of AfCFTA. So I think the key issues here, I know that a lot of work has been done by ECA on this issue, and we can share that with all of you, are looking at the cross-border trading and in the context of AfCFTA, but also in the context of testing, making sure that the test keys are there on the borders to make sure that we are releasing our truck drivers. We've seen a lot of losses of food with some of the drivers having to go back to their countries. We have seen the quarantine because of a lot of them being quarantined. There are real challenges, especially at the borders on those issues. So I wanted to flag that in the context of that. But yes, we need to promote intra-African trade to be able to ensure that we have free movement of services, especially and goods. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joan. There are a couple of questions as well in our chat here about the role of governments and what kinds of support they're providing. Papa Mesa Dieng asks, are governments currently undertaking agroecology and whether seeds are being used are patented or indigenous? I think this also relates to the points you were making, Million, about food sovereignty. What types of not only farming but production systems and food systems we're promoting. Another related question from Angie David says, in the context of our dependence on food imports, which is a shame, I think, how can we fight against climate change and COVID and work for our food sovereignty? So this question that there is actually, if we to deal with the food issue, we need to address the fact that we have climate change involving new forms of vulnerability. And we have this pandemic. What are the key prescriptions that you feel we need to now address? What would be the prognosis for the future, and what are the priority high impact actions that can be taken now by governments, by citizens, by civil society, by the private sector? What should everybody be doing to address the crisis, these multiple crises right now? Over to you, Million. Thank you.
Thank you, Ange. And the other one, I think the first thing that we have to do in terms of protecting the right to food is to protect the most vulnerable in our community. I think that's the most important one, and it's a responsibility of the governments, and it's enshrined in so many laws. So that's the most important to do. The second thing to do, both for COVID and also for climate change, is to implement agroecology. Agroecology is very much critical because it addresses soil, it addresses diversity, which is related to nutrition, as I said, addresses productivity, it increases productivity. We have to increase our productivity, but through what? Through agroecology. And also it addresses so many social issues, including culture. So really looking at our farming system and revamping at our farming system is very much important. I think West African countries are developing a policy for agroecology, not the practice yet. East Africa and Northern Africa and Southern Africa are a bit lagging. Agroecology has not, I mean, it has good currency in civil society and in social movements, but not yet in government spaces. So in terms of food sovereignty, I think the most important thing, which is also in a higher global policy discussion, policy agenda, is reforming the international food system governance. I think that's food system governance at international level, and also at our local level should be reformed with agroecology as space. Thank you.
Many thanks, Million. We're going to need to move towards wrapping up. Of course, the majority of agricultural production in Africa is undertaken by women, actual labor. And of course, labor is one issue that we haven't addressed here. Of course, a lot of agricultural labor is provided by women, but also by migrants. There's migration within and across national borders that's absolutely key for agricultural production. We have one question here that is from Syria Kakizimana, which is, has COVID-19 increased the burden on women in terms of producing, accessing and distributing food in Africa? Perhaps not only burden, but, you know, are the impacts gender differentiated? Typically when crises hit, women pick up the pieces. We know that there are gender distinctions in terms of responsibilities for production, for trade and so on. Who would like to address the issue of the gendered nature of the food crisis? Muniba, could I put you on the spot? Yes, I thought so. Yes, 1 minute.
Thank you, Ruth. Yes, in terms of fisheries, I just recently had you know, inputs from East, West Africa, and Southern Africa, and women has definitely been impacted negatively. A lot of women in terms of fisheries deal with trade, and to link with Joan's interregional trade, because trade could not happen. They could not sell, they could not access fish from small-scale fishers. That definitely impacted them. A lot of what women are also saying is that an added burden that is placed on them, the children are home. So a lot of the women also need to now look at schooling of children and support schooling of it. And a lot of the interventions, whether it is COVID grant or support, it doesn't go directly to women. It would either relieve fishermen and not women. So in fisheries, there has definitely been a direct impact on women across the continent. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Muniba. Now, I think we'll just take one more comment question before we finish up. So there is a question from Cara Grace. Jones comments that in a time of crisis, there is room for an elite land grab. Can you elaborate on this phenomenon? I find this an interesting question, Joan. If we think back to the last massive economic crisis that was linked with a food crisis, which was 2008, what we saw, I mean, this was a moment where, you know, for instance, key food items, the price of rice quadrupled within a year. So the instability in global food markets, there were oil price spikes, and there was a financial crisis at the same time. All of this led, in fact, to the revaluation of land and investors from around the world looking for a new investment frontier. That was the start of what many people call, you know, the new scramble for Africa, land grabbing in Africa. You know, can you talk perhaps a bit about this elite land grab? Perhaps we were wrong to assume that this is all about foreign investors. There's also very much a domestic issue around elite land grabbing, which has been a key concern of NELGA and of our partner institutions. Are we likely to be seeing this again, or are we in a different situation?
Thanks, Ruth. I think we are likely to be seeing it, and a lot of those that don't have the power right now, they would be seeing it. On the one hand, we have a problem because of institutions not being able to respond. The government being absent and busy elsewhere means that they are not actually able to police what's happening with the land issue. So you see, the courts that are looking at land issues and disputes are actually not actually functioning. The systems, because of the lockdown and because of the restrictions, not just of movement, but people telecommuting, means that the land courts did not, I don't know whether they're still functioning, like in most countries, they're not functioning. There is that aspect of it, which means that those with the information of what is happening are already starting to encroach into land. I mentioned to you that I faced an issue when people went in and started cutting our trees, because you can't go to the police. But I think there's a broader question then on whenever agriculture or food becomes an item, so to speak, we see land values going up. And those that have the information or the power would then be able to come into that space and take advantage of the situation. And especially when our smallholders and pastoralists and communal, those who are in communal land situations don't really understand or do not have the information a priori of the shocks that are actually happening. So this is where I think we need to step in, civil society and governments, to be able to provide support. and to be able to protect those communities.
Thank you so much, Joan. Colleagues, we're going to have to leave it there. I feel that we've only touched on the terrain. Luckily, we will be able to deepen the conversation as we go forward. Next week, our webinar will go ahead at the same time, which is 1 p.m. Central African time on a Thursday. And our topic next week, our title is Fattening the Curve: Urban Food Systems During the COVID-19 Crisis, a comparison of South Africa and Ghana. Please do keep an eye on the PLAS website, also our Twitter handle, and on our YouTube channel. You are able to watch this or share this link with others. This webinar will be available on the same YouTube link from now on, so you can refer back to it. I would like to thank again very much our colleagues, Dr. Joan Kagwanja in Kenya, Professor Mamadou Goita in Mali, Dr. Million Bile from Ethiopia, and Professor Moniba Isaacs in Cape Town. My name is Ruth, and thank you for joining us. Do join us again next week, Thursday, for our next webinar.